Chapter 10 of Captain John Smith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Michael Fassio. Captain John Smith by C.H. Forbes-Lindsay. The Three Turks. A truce having been declared for the day of the combat, the opposing armies approached each other without restraint, but their soldiery did not mingle. The Christians were drawn up, a short distance from the city, in battle array with a great display of banners, trophies, and the various insignia of heraldry. The Moslems, assembled in a regular mass beneath the grey walls of the beleaguered town, whilst their women, attended by slaves, occupied points of vantage along the ramparts. Between the bodies of eager spectators lay a stretch of sward, which had been enclosed in a barricade after the fashion of the lists in the old-time tournaments. Long before the hour set for the contest, the troops had assembled on either side. In both armies the keenest interest in the affair prevailed, and both realized that it was something more than a duel to the death, for the result would surely encourage the fighting men of one party as much as it would depress those of the other. In those days of superstition, men were ever ready to find an augury in every important event, and the army to whom the victory should fall would accept it as a promise of success in the final issue. It must be confessed that the greater degree of confidence was enjoyed by the Turks. Their champion was a man in the prime of life and a soldier of approved valor and skill in arms. He had never been defeated in single combat, although twice pitted against Germans of renown. The Christians, on the other hand, could not shake off the doubt and apprehension which they shared with their leader when the lot fell to the young Briton. The army had long since learned to respect his courage and fighting qualities in battle, and of his quick-wittedness they had received ample proof on the march to Regal. But none of them had any evidence of his ability to yield the lance, a weapon that demanded years of practice before a man might become expert with it. Thus it happened that the Germans, of whom the army was mostly composed, stood grim, silent, and anxious, whilst the swarthy Ottomans gave vent to their elation in song and jest. The combatants were to meet when the sun should be precisely in mid-heaven, so that neither might be at a disadvantage of having its rays in his eyes. The rules required the challenger to be the first in the field, and in due time Tur Pasha, heralded by the sounds of hautboys, passed through the gates of the city and slowly made his way into the lists. His appearance elicited enthusiastic shouts from his countrymen and even forced ejaculations of admiration from the ranks of their enemies. The Turkish champion presented a brave figure. His proud bearing and graceful carriage in the saddle were enhanced by the stately action of the beautiful white Arab steed which he rode. He was clad in a splendid suit of burnished steel armor, richly inlaid with arabesque figures in gold. Upon his shoulders were fixed a pair of large wings made from eagle's feathers, set in a frame of silver and garnished with gold and precious stones. He was attended by 3 Janissaries, one going before and bearing his lance, the others walking on either side and leading his horse to the station assigned him. No sooner had Tur Pasha taken up position at his end of the lists than a flurry of trumpets announced the appearance of John Smith. The champion of the Christians presented an aspect as simple as his name, and no less sturdy. His chestnut horse was a big, strong Norman, of the breed far famed for service in battle. His armor was of plain steel, and bore upon its surface many a dent and eloquent witness of hard knocks. The only touch of finery about the Englishman was the plume of black feathers which surmounted his helmet. He came upon the field attended by 1 page, carrying his lance. After Captain John Smith had halted at his post, the 2 champions sat like statues facing each other for a few minutes, affording the spectators opportunity to compare their points. At a signal blast from the trumpet, the antagonists rode forward slowly and met midway in the course. Saluting courteously, they passed each other, wheeled about, and returned to their respective stations. A prolonged note from the trumpet warned the combatants to let down their visors and set their lances in rest. The next gave the signal for the onset, and before it had died away each horseman had sprung forward, urging his charger to its utmost speed. As soon as he felt that his horse was in full career, Smith leant forward, slackening the bridle and grasping the pommel of the saddle with his left hand to steady himself. His lance was couched at a level with his adversary's breast, and his gaze was steadily fixed on the slit in the visor through which the wearer looked. Nearer and nearer approached the onrushing horseman. A few more strides, 2 brief seconds, and they must meet in the shock. John can at last discern the glistening eyes of the Turk, and in that instant he raises the point of his lance towards the other's face. The sudden movement disconcerts the Turkish champion. Involuntarily he shifts his aim, and his weapon passes harmlessly over the Englishman's shoulder at the moment that our hero's lance enters the eye of Tur Pasha and penetrates his brain. He fell from his horse, and Smith leaped to the ground and unbuckled his helmet. A glance sufficed to show that the Turk was dead, and with a stroke of his sword John severed the head from the body. Whilst the pagans in mournful procession carried the headless trunk of their recent champion into Regal, Smith was triumphantly escorted back to the camp of the besiegers. He ordered the head of Tur Pasha to be borne to the quarters of Prince Moises, who was pleased to accept the grisly trophy. The spoils of victory were not unacceptable to John, but he had no desire to trick himself out in the fancy armor with its trimmings, and these he sold for a good round sum. The horse, however, he was glad to keep, for he had long wished for an extra mount for light service. But heretofore his slender means had denied him that advantage. In wars of the time, captains who could afford to do so kept 2 or more horses during a campaign, one to carry them on the march, and another to ride in battle. For a man in armor was no light burden, and a beast that had borne its master 10 or 12 miles would not be fit at the end of the journey for great exertion, although the life of its owner might depend upon its rendering spirited service. Captain Smith now had the satisfaction of knowing that he was one of the best mounted men in the army, for the Arab was a marvel of speed and agility, and the Norman had been thoroughly trained by himself, and was a perfect battle horse. The chief mourner in Regal was one Gurago, a fierce warrior, who had been the bosom friend of the slain Pasha. When the funeral rites had been performed after the Mohammed custom, Gurago sent a message to Captain John Smith proposing to redeem his friend's head at the risk of his own. He also offered to pledge his horse, arms, and accoutrements on the issue. It is hardly necessary to say that the challenge was accepted with alacrity. Flushed with his recent victory and more than ever confident in his skill, our champion was delighted at this early chance for another display of his prowess. The consent of the general was readily obtained. Prince Moises was greatly pleased at the cheering effect Smith's success had worked upon the troops, and he was no longer doubtful of the Breton's ability to uphold the honor of the Christian army. The preparations were made as before, and the next day was appointed for the combat. Once more the walls were lined with the fair dames of Regal, and in their shadow assembled the garrison, more subdued than on the former occasion, but buoyed by hopes of better fortune. The Christians, on their part, lined up, exultant and strong in the expectation of another victory for their champion. Gurago entered the lists almost as splendidly mounted and equipped as the Pasha had been. Captain Smith wore the same plain but serviceable suit of armor, and rode his trusty Norman charger. He had again exercised his right as the challenged to name the lance as the principal weapon of the combat. At the trumpet signal, the combatants spurred forward at full speed, each with his weapon well and firmly aimed at his opponent's breast. They met in mid-career with a crash that resounded over the field. The lances flew into pieces. The horses fell back upon their haunches. Both riders reeled under the shock, but each contrived to keep his seat. Casting aside the splintered spears, they drew their pistols from the saddle pockets. Smith was the first to fire, but at the instant of the discharge the Turk's horse swerved, and the bullet hummed harmlessly by his master's head. Gurago had reserved his shot, and now took careful aim. The Norman, in response to the pressure of his rider's legs, was gathering himself for a spring out of the line of fire when the report of the Turk's pistol rang out. The ball struck John's headpiece fair in the center of the forehead, but failed to penetrate the steel. Our hero was stunned, and sight suddenly forsook him. The bridle dropped from his nerveless fingers, and he swayed in his seat. He gave himself up for lost as he felt his senses deserting him. Then came the thought that he was the champion of the Christian army, that they were watching him, depending upon him to secure victory for them. Exerting all his will at his command, he set his teeth together and fought back the inclination to swoon. Gruago, seeing his enemy at his mercy, smiled with grim satisfaction as he drew his second pistol, intending to dispatch the Christian youth with deliberate and sure aim. But the trusty Norman had not been trained to battle for nothing. The loose seat in the saddle and the relaxed grip of the bridle told him that his master was in distress and depended upon him to save his life. With quick but easy action, so as not to unseat the rider, the intelligent beast strode out of range. The Turk wheeled and galloped after him. His was the swifter steed, and he had no difficulty in overtaking Smith's charger. But each time, as he leveled his weapon to fire, the Norman darted away at an angle. In this manner the gallant animal contrived to prolong the combat for many minutes. Meanwhile, Smith's senses and his strength were fast reviving. It gladdened the noble steed to feed the returning firmness of seat and grasp the bridle, and his master, as his sight cleared, began to lend his guidance to the clever tactics of the animal. When Captain Smith fully realized the situation, he made up his mind that success could be secured only by bold and daring action. In his weakened state he could not hope to overcome the Turk in a prolonged fight. He must rely upon surprising the other and bringing the affair to an issue by a sudden attack. Gruago would not risk his last shot until he could make sure of his aim. He probably believed our hero to be sorely wounded, and had no thought of his reviving or resuming the offensive. In one of his horse's evasive rushes, Smith bent forward upon the animal's neck, as though overcome by sudden pain, but the movement was made to enable him to stealthily draw his loaded pistol from the holster. Holding it concealed behind the high pommel of his saddle, he braced his nerves for the final effort. Once more Gruago approached his foe, but this time, instead of allowing his horse to spring aside, John urged him forward, straight at the astonished Turk. Before the latter could recover his presence of mind sufficiently to use his weapon, the Englishman's pistol was discharged full in his face, and he fell to the ground in a dying state. Smith dismounted and gave the Turk his coup de grace, or finishing stroke, and then cut off his head. This proceeding must strike us as being cold-blooded and merciless, but it was strictly in accordance with the terms of the combat, and the character of the age in which our hero lived. Our forefathers of the 17th century were as rough as they were brave. They lived amid scenes of strife and bloodshed, and men who hazarded their own lives daily naturally held those of their enemies cheap. This second defeat was a severe blow to the defenders of Regal. Their two foremost champions had been vanquished, and by a beardless boy, for Captain Smith at this time had barely passed his 21st year. There were no more challenges from the disheartened garrison. They lost all desire to afford pastime for the ladies, and they ceased to find the Christians subjects for contemptuous jests, as they had done in the early days of the siege. Their sallies were now of rare occurrence, and were easily repelled, so that the work of preparation for the final assault upon the city went forward with little interruption. Our hero, in whom love of action was second nature, chafed sorely under the slow and tedious engineering operations. At length he sought and obtained permission from Prince Moises to send a challenge into the city. This message was couched in the most courteous terms, and was addressed to the ladies of Regal, our hero shrewdly suspecting that in this way he would more quickly touch the honor of the men. Captain John Smith begged to assure the ladies of Regal that he was not so enamored of the heads of their servants, but that he was ready to restore them upon proper terms. He urged the ladies to send forth a champion who would risk his head in the effort to regain those of the vanquished Turks. Captain Smith concluded by expressing his willingness that his own head should accompany the others in case the champion of the ladies proved the victor in the proposed combat. In due time an acceptance of this challenge was received from one Boney Mulgrew, and a day was set for the trial of arms. The conditions of this third duel were similar to those that governed the two preceding combats, with the exception of one important particular. John Smith being the challenger on this occasion, the choice of weapons rested with his adversary. Mulgrew had no stomach for a contest with the lance, of which Smith had proved himself a master. He chose to fight with a pistol, battle-axe, and falchion. In the use of these weapons, and especially the battle-axe, he was expert. This wise decision of the Turk came near to undoing our hero, as the sequel will show. At the signal of attack, the combatants advanced upon each other, but not at the charge as would have been the case had lances been their weapons. Instead, they caused their horses to curvet and prance and change suddenly from one direction to another. These maneuvers, resembling those of two wrestlers, were designed to disconcert the aim, and in the present instance did so with such complete effect that each of the champions emptied two pistols without touching his enemy. They now resorted to the battle-axe, on which the Turk rested his hope of success. He found in Captain John Smith an antagonist little less proficient than himself. For a while the strife waxed warm and fast without any perceptible advantage to either. Heavy blows were aimed and fended without ceasing, leaving neither, as Smith tells us, with, quote, "scarce sense enough to keep his saddle." Unquote. At length a hard blow delivered by the Turk struck John's weapon near the head, and it flew from his hand. At the sight of this advantage gained by their champion, the people of Regal set up such a shout as to shake the walls of the city. It was a critical moment. Smith was disarmed. The Turk was within arm's length of him. He raised his battle-axe to strike a crushing blow. Before it could descend, the Norman charger had sprung aside, and the weapon cut the air harmlessly. But the danger was only averted for a moment. The Turk pressed close upon his adversary, striving to strike, but each time the axe was raised, the good horse reared suddenly or sprung away. Meanwhile, Captain Smith had succeeded in drawing his falchion. Hardly had its point cleared the scabbard when Mulgrew again came on with an incautious rush. As the Turk raised his arm to swing the heavy weapon, Smith thrust with full force and ran his sword through the body of Boney Mulgrew. The Christian army was fairly wild with delight at this third victory of Captain John Smith, and the commander ordered a pageant in his honor. With an escort of 6,000 men-at-arms, the 3 Turks' heads, and the spoils of the 3 combats borne before him, Captain Smith was conducted to the pavilion of the general, who received him surrounded by his principal officers. Prince Moises embraced our hero in the presence of the troops, and after complimenting him warmly on his valiant deeds, presented him with a splendid charger, richly caparisoned, a beautiful scimitar of Damascus steel, and a belt containing 300 ducats. But more highly than these gifts, John valued the distinction bestowed upon him by his old commander, Count Meldridge. Truly proud of his young protege, there and then appointed him a major captain in his regiment. Nor were these the only rewards that fell to the lot of Captain John Smith on account of his prowess at the siege of Regal. At a later period, when the knowledge of his conduct came to Duke Sigismund Balthor of Transylvania, he presented our hero with a picture of himself set in gold, conferred upon him a yearly pension of 300 ducats, a snug sum in those days, and capped all with the patent of nobility. This patent entitled Captain John Smith to a coat of arms bearing 3 Turks' heads in a shield. John Smith's patent of nobility, setting forth the deeds for which it was confirmed, may be seen at the College of Heralds, London, where, in its original Latin form, it was officially recorded August 19th, 1625, by Sir William Sagar, Garter King at Arms. Chapter 10